Throughout 1967, the North Vietnamese government was busy planning an attack that they hoped would guarantee them final victory over the U.S.-backed Republic of Vietnam. The plan, later known as the Tet Offensive, called for the NVA and VC to pin down American forces by attacking their supply routes. While this was happening, communists would disrupt South Vietnam's governmental and civilian centers. The city of Hue was one of the Tet Offensive's key targets.
Hue is the ancient imperial town where the kings lived.
If the communists succeeded in capturing Hue, it would deal a major blow on Southern morale and disrupt the Republic's political credibility. Hue was also an important city to American forces. Highway 1, which was a major land supply route for Allied troops stationed at the DMZ, passed through Hue. The Allies also took advantage of Hue's proximity to the Xuang Hong, or Perfume River, to transport waterborne supplies inland from the coast. The city of Hue was separated into two very different sections by the Perfume River. The Citadel, which lay north of the Xuang Hong, hosted 2/3 of the city's population and was surrounded on all sides by a huge wall. South of the Perfume River lay Hue's modern section. Defending Hue was the South Vietnamese Army, or ARVN, 1st Infantry Division, which was headquartered at a compound located in the Citadel's northwest corner. Until the Tet Offensive, Hue had been virtually free from war. The defenders of Hue did not think twice about granting many men leave to celebrate the Tet holiday. Just days before, a 2-day ceasefire had been negotiated with North Vietnam.
The idea during Tet is for the Vietnamese to go back to their ancestral home, wherever it is. So you've got 75 or 80% of the population on the move, which provided great cover for the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong as they got in position, because everybody was moving and not expecting that the truce, which had been declared by both sides, was going to be violated.
This would all change after January 30th, 1968, when Hue became the site of the Tet Offensive's longest and most costly battle.
Truth be known, the Tet Offensive began January 30, January 31st, because their coordination wasn't as great as they said, and it was actually one of the attacks. The North Vietnamese, General Giap, was said to be the guy that planned it and executed the operation, was to attack as many province headquarters and district headquarters simultaneously throughout all of South Vietnam.
In the days leading up to January 30th, 8,000 communist soldiers gathered in the Hue region. The 5th NVA Regiment was assigned the task of preventing enemy reinforcements from reaching the city. The 4th NVA Regiment would capture political and military objectives in the modern section of Hue, chiefly the U.S. MACV compound. The 6th NVA Regiment was ordered to take the Citadel, and with it, the Imperial Palace. The NVA and VC who attacked Hue on January 30th and 31st, 1968, enjoyed several advantages. Chief among these was the element of surprise. Hue had not yet been attacked during the Vietnam War, and General Trong doubted that North Vietnamese forces would attack the city directly. With their trap in place, North Vietnamese forces readied themselves on January 30th to attack an unsuspecting and unprepared foe. A thick fog encompassed Hue on the night of January 29th.
The weather was terrible. We went from the tropics in the south to temperatures in the low 50s or 48, but when you've been operating in 90, 95 degrees, it feels like you're walked into a refrigerator, you know, and trying to find ways to stay warm. The weather was, rain was bad.
On January 29th, General No Quang Trong had received reports of VC attacks on Nha Trang, Da Nang, and other South Vietnamese cities. Sensing that something was wrong, Trong ordered most of his remaining forces to take up defensive positions outside the city's urban area. The only regular ARVN soldiers that remained inside Hue were the Hak Bao Black Panther Reconnaissance Company. This company was made up entirely of volunteers and served as the ARVN's elite recon and rapid reaction force. The Viet Cong took up their positions around the city and waited for the signal to attack. The quiet night was shattered at 0340 when NVA Rocket Battalion, hiding in the western hills overlooking Hue, fired a sheaf of 122mm rockets on the sleeping city. As the barrage died down, NVA and VC assault troops waiting outside Hue rushed toward the city's gates. Despite overrunning most of the citadel, including the Imperial Palace, North Vietnamese forces failed to capture the 1st ARVN Division command compound after running into unexpected barbed wire barriers. The Communists failed to capture the Tay Loc airfield when they were slowed down by another barbed wire barrier. After pouring into the city's modern section, NVA and VC units captured all of their objectives, save one, the American MACV compound. With most of Hue under their control, an NVA infantry company headed toward an immense flagpole in front of the citadel. They then replaced the Republic's flag with that of the National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong. This flag would become a symbol for communist control at Hue.
Westmoreland was calling Cushman every morning and asking if the North Vietnamese flag flying over the ancient Imperial Palace was down or not. And when Cushman would tell him, "Not yet, sir," Westmoreland would just slam the phone down.
Hope seemed bleak for the defenders of both the MACV and ARVN compounds, but reinforcements were not far away. General Trong had managed to contact the South Vietnamese chain of command, and plans were made to reinforce the ARVN compound so long as they could hold off communist forces until help arrived. Advisors at the MACV also managed to send a plea for help to the base at Phu Bai. Lieutenant General Robert Cushman III, commander of the Marine Amphibious Force, ordered Task Force X-Ray to send reinforcements to Hue. As the Marines prepared to reinforce the MACV, NVA units, hell-bent on preventing such a reunion from occurring, took blocking positions throughout the city. At first, Task Force X-Ray's commanding officer only dispatched a single Marine company to Hue. Operating with limited intelligence, he was under the impression that only a small enemy force had infiltrated Hue.
I got into combat gear and joined the 1st Vietnamese Marine Battalion, which was part of the effort to retake the JGS headquarters, which is the South Vietnamese version of the Pentagon. There were about 7 or 8 days of bitter fighting in 2 different neighborhoods.
The men of Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 1st U.S. Marine Regiment, found the 2-lane highway completely deserted. After meeting up with 5 Marine M48 tanks, Alpha Company continued toward the MACV compound they had been sent to relieve. Just before the Marines reached their objective, NVA soldiers opened fire, pinning Alpha Company between the Perfume River and the Phu Cam Canal. With Alpha Company pinned down and unable to reach the MACV, a reactionary force was quickly assembled at Phu Bai and dispatched to Hue. Gulf Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, brought 2 self-propelled twin 40mm guns with it and managed to reach Alpha Company without much resistance. Together, The two Marine companies, using these self-propelled guns and tanks, fought their way to the MACV compound. Along with being undermanned at first, Marines inside of Way had several other disadvantages. Unlike their enemy, the Marines had virtually no training for urban warfare.
We were totally unprepared for that, so we just cleared everything by grenades. You know, before you went in anything, you threw grenades in. And sniping was terrible from their side. They shot the hell out of us, you know, crossing the street. You had to be scared to cross the street. I mean, move from one building to another was just you know, you're leaving yourself open to get hit and wounded. We had a lot of wounded, in there.
The tragedy of it was all the vital lessons that we learned on how to fight house to house. And the Marines, certainly in Vietnam, we had never fought house to house. We were the best jungle fighters, rice paddy fighters, village fighters you could ask for. Wall-to-wall houses, 3-story buildings, glass window, towns, cars, civilians, massive amounts of civilians caught in between us and the NVA. We had no idea how to fight. We had no, you know, our officers, Colonel Cheatham at the time, was having books on Inchon, Marines fighting in Seoul, flowing to him so he could read about tactics on how to fight city to city. That unit, when the 12th and the 2.5 was so depleted, none of that knowledge transferred over to 1.5. 1.5 had to learn all over how to fight in cities. It was a little different. They had to learn how to fight against a 15-foot mortared wall and a huge provincial headquarters. But it was a whole new learning process, and it cost a lot of lives to learn.
Also, the Marines were denied close air support at first because of bad weather and the risk of damaging Way's historical landmarks.
We began with almost no artillery fire. We had rules of engagement that restricted our ability to shoot at historically valuable sites, which we adhered to for a while until the other side quickly picked up. The North Vietnamese picked up what we were not shooting at. They moved there.
Despite these hindrances, the Marines set about their task of sweeping South Way clear of NVA and VC troops. At 0700 on February 1st, a platoon of Gulf 2nd of the 5th Marines, a group of volunteers from the MACV, and 2 M48 tanks were dispatched to recapture Way Prison and the Thao Thien Province headquarters. Between the Marines and their objective was 6 blocks of heavily defended cityscape. The Marines barely made it a block away from the MACV compound before NVA snipers opened fire on them. In the confrontation, one of the M48 tanks was destroyed by a 57mm recoilless rifle. The attack had been stopped cold.
Because of the viciousness of it and the fighting of it and the fact that, you know, we couldn't get resupplied, it was hard. You just couldn't spare anybody. But we were taking so many casualties. I mean, it was, you know, when you read the after battle report, we lost 100, Marines had 140, 107, 150 killed. Now that doesn't sound like much, certainly when you compare it to the number of NVA that were killed. But that's 150 Marines dead. And then there was another almost, well, there was over 350 of them wounded so badly they had to be medevaced. So we just didn't have. People would stay in that battle with 2 and 3 Purple Hearts. They'd tell the corpsmen to tag up the tags. It was a shrapnel wound or a wound. They kept on fighting. I fought with guys that had 2 and 3 bandages, but they weren't going for 2 reasons. One is they knew there was nobody going to come in and replace them that could stay alive. And 2, most of us never expected to come out away alive. After a while, after you'd been in that city for long enough, there was only 2 ways out. And you knew that you were either going to go out dead, which had a high degree of probability, or you were going to go out seriously wounded. And that's just basically the 2 choices.
The 11 blocks between the MACV compound and the Perfume River had been heavily fortified by the NVA and required Marines to clear them out, building by building. Progress was slow as the Marines made their way toward the post office and Treasury building. From positions in buildings along the way, NVA troops shot at the Marines with mortars, rockets, and machine guns.
We had 2 battalions reinforced of Vietnamese Marines and a battalion reinforced of U.S. Marines, and there were about 20,000 North Vietnamese. It was a division reinforced, and it was slogging it, grenades. We used some rocket launchers. We used something called the Ontos, which had recoilless rifles, 6 recoilless rifles. Ontos is a Greek word for thing. It's the most ugly weapon there ever was, but if you would see an emplacement in the corner of a building that was hardened, we weren't able to do anything with it that infantry weapons could deal with, but you'd bring that recoilless rifle out just long enough to fire at the corner. We had 1 or 2 tanks.
On February 4th, the Marines launched a bitter attack which lasted almost 24 hours. Finally, they reached the Treasury building. On February 6th, Hotel 2nd of the 5th took the Thao Thien Province Administration Center after peppering the building with 181 millimeter mortar rounds and 60 106 millimeter recoilless rounds. Once the building was cleared out, Captain George R. Christmas radioed that, "We have the building, sir. We're going to run up the American flag." By February 14th, most of South Way was in American control. Despite their success, 38 Marines had died, and another 320 were wounded in South Way. The VC and NVA had lost over 1,000. On February 10th, General Trong asked for Marine assistance, and LeHue ordered a battalion to enter the old city.
And the wall was a problem because it was a city surrounded by this huge, huge wall. And you have to take the high ground. You hear that? Usually you want to be on the high ground. So that we had to take the wall, and they fought bitterly to keep us off the wall. And you would get up on the wall, you'd gain the top of the wall, and there were farms up on the wall. There were structures on the wall. There were gardens and crops growing. And like I say, it was not a football field, but it sure was 50 meters across. And they were dug in on the top. So some of the most bitter fighting wasn't down below, although there certainly was. The most bitter fighting was up on the walls.
Even though the odds seemed to be stacking up against North Vietnamese forces inside the citadel, they were determined to hold their ground. After arriving in the old city, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines launched an attack down the citadel's east wall. They were met immediately with heavy enemy fire that seemingly came from every building. 15 Marines were killed and another 40 wounded in that brief action. A fresh battalion was brought in. With help from airstrikes, naval gunfire, and artillery, they were able to advance slowly.
Almost back to your World War II, big unit against big unit. I think our big rival at that time was like the 324th B NVA battalion, and they were tough people. They were pretty good. They'd ambush us, we'd ambush them, and have a few set piece, battles. If you see, I'd seen Way City right out there. It was still going on when I got into there, but I wasn't directly involved in Way until we were at the. Can't remember what the compound was, but I'm trying to remember the compound we were at when they were still in the city. They were over the Citadel, and anyway, we were still at the compound when they hit the Citadel, and they were trying to route to the NVA out of the Citadel.
By this point, the U.S. had lifted its ban on firing at historical buildings and began blasting the city. Buildings were reduced to rubble all over Way, as an estimated 10,000 houses were destroyed or damaged.
But after that, the city was just about in ruins. We have what we didn't blow up, I think, fell down on its own.
The next day, Marines launched an attack to capture a tower along the Citadel's eastern wall.
Suddenly we got a scream, heard some screams and a guy yelling, a Marine calling for a corpsman up on the wall. And I had looked up there just a second before, and 2 Marines were standing up, moving to this partial wall that was still there. One of the Marines got shot in the throat, and he was dying of his own blood. And that was what the corpsman was yelling about. And the corpsman said, "I need help. Somebody get up here and help me." Well, I bolted across the street and jumped up on the wall where it had been blowing out and I could get into it. And I ran up and I got to the corpsman and I looked in the face, and it was his face of this kid who the day before I had written a great story about him. He had spent the night in a tower throwing NVA grenades back at the NVA. They'd run out of ammunition. They held the tower for that whole night, small arms, hand-to-hand combat, and he'd survived it. And that morning when I heard the story, I went to find him. He was sitting there reading his Bible, just as calm as could be. And I looked down his face, and it was him. And he's just blood coming out. Anyway, that was just instant recognition. I grabbed one arm, the corpsman grabbed another arm. We started dragging him, running across this field of fire to get down to the road to where we could get him out of plain view.
Bernston and the corpsman tried to get the wounded Marine to the nearest aid station.
We got down the street and ran, and they were picking off but we got down to a corner where we could turn around and get out of the fire. And there was this little old Lamborghini bus laying on side, and so we laid him down there to start. The corpsman started doing a tracheotomy on him. And I stood up and I saw a shutter door, one of those French shutter doors. And I said, "I'll grab that for a stretcher because we got to get him out of fire. We're still on fire."
Bernston suddenly went from giving aid to becoming a casualty himself.
I stood up to get it. Just as I stood up to get it, a B-40 rocket, which they had targeted on us because they could see where we were, fell right about 4 feet in front of me. And it was fortunate it was 4 feet because the blast hadn't radiated. So I got the big chunks. Got hit with the big chunks. It radiated and got some other Marines wounded, but I took a couple of real big chunks. I had a huge smoldering piece in my arm, all up and down my back. Both my legs were blowing up. The concussion knocked me out, threw me out in the street, and had also thrown out the kid with the tracheotomy. And as we were laying in the street, up on the wall, an NVA opened up with a machine gun and shot both of us. Unfortunately, shot him a couple of times. It just got me once. And then somebody got the machine gun, and then they drug us off the street.
Bernston's best friend witnessed the explosion.
Tragic thing happened during that fight. A good friend of mine by the name of, my best friend at the time by the name of Sergeant Steve Bernston was hit badly. He was trying to cross the street. I was firing cover on one side, and Steve went out, got himself into the street, and they fired an RPG right down the street and hit a truck that he was next to. There was another wounded Marine there. He was after him, I think. They hit the truck, and the RPG went off and hit him badly in the leg and in the arm. We had to evacuate him out of there. All of us had been hit prior to that time.
Dye was shocked by his reaction to the scene.
So we were all hurt, but when Steve got hit, it sort of took some wind out of my sails. I mean, we'd seen a lot of dead men, and we were fairly used to that, and we'd seen a lot of bad wounds, and we were fairly used to that. But it was your pal, you know. He was down, and he was down hard, and I didn't know how hard it was going to be. I mean, he looked pretty bad. Some good-sized chunks of shrapnel took him. So we got him out of there, and I wondered, Jesus, you know, what's going on? And I think at that moment I had one of the epiphanies, one of the great lessons of combat that I've often used to train actors to this day. I had a very strange reaction to Steve's getting hit, and it was right there in front of me, next to me. the initial reaction I had, you know, the normal human being would think anger, grief, fear, shock, that sort of thing. No, my first reaction was joy. It was elation. And later I found out why. I mean, by questioning myself, I was elated because it wasn't me.
First Arvin Corps declared Way secure on February 25, 1968. However, the battle would not be declared officially over until March 2, 1968. Way was the longest and bloodiest ground action of the Tet Offensive, and quite possibly the longest and bloodiest single action of the Second Indochina War.